This is my dungeon. Welcome to my dungeon. So as an example, here are new registrants just from today. So these are all individuals that are getting registered under the Indian Act.
How many are there? You got like 5, 6?
So today we got 6.
6 new registrants in one day.
Yeah.
Seems like a lot.
Well, this is almost daily. Sometimes we get 3, sometimes we get 10, sometimes 12, sometimes 2. But every day.
Nick Ottawa holds up a stack of papers, all with the Government of Canada logo on them. On this day alone, 6 new people are seeking what is still legally called Indian status, joining Kitigan-Zibi First Nation. Nick is the one responsible for registering new members of this Algonquin Reserve in Western Quebec. You have 6 letters there that have come in from the Canadian federal government. How many of those names do you recognize?
Oh, recognize? Right now, I have heard or know of none of them. And they tie into a man that was on the reserve who was born in 1830.
Having status matters. It entails tax benefits, hunting rights, support for post-secondary education, and health programs. But while Nick registers new members, it's not up to him to decide who rightfully has status. That is controlled by the Government of Canada.
A lot of people get mad because a lot of times I'm the front source that tells them you cannot register your child. I'm sorry. And a lot of people get mad, and the first thing they say is that's not fair. The Indian Act was never fair. The Indian Act is the most unfair legislation that I can think of in all of Canada's history.
Next week marks 150 years since the Indian Act became law in Canada. It's been called unfair, racist, and unquestionably sexist. So why is it still being used? I'm Catherine Cullen, and on this special edition of The House, we're going to look at just how repressive this law has been over the last century and a half, why attempts to fix it have been so messy. We'll dig into why, despite all that, many First Nations do not want the Act to simply be scrapped, and what a better future could look like. This special edition of The House is now in session. Just down the road from the Kitigan-Zibi Band Council office, Chief Jean-Guy Whiteduck is showing me around the First Nations Cultural Centre.
Well, I think you see a lot of artifacts. Most of the artifacts come from the Ottawa River area.
He peers into some glass display cases containing wampum belts. The purple and white beads are woven into patterns and mark agreements between peoples.
Well, there's a variety of wampums. Some wampums talk about agreements with government. There's a wampum with the Bank of Canada that deals with money.
Wow.
Wampum could mean many, many things.
Whiteduck was first elected chief of Kitigan-Zibi in 1976. He's been in the role off and on since then, leading the community for more than 3 decades in total.
I decided to run as chief in 76. Same year Levesque was elected, as a matter of fact. We had a small office, maybe 24 by 32, near the community hall. We had 1 employee, and we have 200 people working for us now at different levels. You know, we have a police force, we have a health and social services, education.
He's clearly proud of how the reserve has developed since that time, but there are other, more troubling memories.
Clearly, the Indian Act had tremendous impact from the early day on. You're really controlling a population.
Do you remember the times when people couldn't leave, they couldn't drink, they couldn't dance?
Yeah, I remember that. I remember the RCMP used to patrol the reserve, yeah. If somebody was having a beer, you get arrested. There was a dry reserve, that control consumption of alcohol in the community. If you wanted to leave this community, you had to get permission. Up to the 1960s, you had to get permission from the Indian agent to leave. You couldn't leave without their authority. It's a dictatorship, as far as I'm concerned.
The Indian Act restricted more than just whether First Peoples could move about freely. It also banned important gatherings such as sun dances and the gift-giving ceremonies called potlatches. It imposed a political system on First Nations communities, including a chief and council. And it's worth pointing out that the Indian Act applied to First Nations, but not Métis or Inuit. So how did Canada come to set up such a system? And why has there been such a struggle to fix the Act? Bob Joseph is the author of 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. He's in Victoria. And Janice Makokis is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor. She's in Edmonton. Welcome to the program to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Janice, next week marks 150 years since the Indian Act became law. Why was it created?
At the core of it, it was really about assimilation, control, and enfranchisement, and really undoing the original laws, governance structures of Indigenous people and implementing or supplanting this colonial regime on top of that. Just to put it bluntly, it was really about turning Indigenous peoples into Canadians and assimilating them into the Canadian body politic, which I think the first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, summarizes it as, we will continue until there's not a single Indian left in Canada that has not been absorbed into Canada's body politic.
I'd like Bob to sort of help paint a picture for people who might not have had the opportunity to read your book, who might not know about some of the effects of the Indian Act. So it created the residential school system, which you point out is the most aggressive and destructive part of the Act. But what else might people not know about the most severe impacts?
Yeah, I think probably the big one would be this notion that a status Indian is a ward of the Crown. And when you're a ward of the Crown, you really have no power. The Crown has the power. And so that affects you birth to death. They can really control your life from birth to death. You couldn't leave the reserve. You couldn't go to a pool hall. You couldn't drink at a public place. Post-secondary education, if you got a post-secondary education, you had to leave the reserve and become like everybody else. You gave up your status. So it was just constant, in addition to residential schools, constant aggressive efforts to forcibly, culturally assimilate, and of course very problematic for the country, which didn't know what to do when they didn't assimilate.
You talk about those cultural restrictions. There were limits on gatherings, dancing, potlatches. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so on the West Coast here we did potlatching, which is a gift-giving ceremony. I'm actually, I have a hereditary chief's name and a chief's seat, but I haven't done my potlatch. I haven't done my gift-giving ceremony. And, some of the things that were said about us were, we're giving away all of our wealth, leaving nothing but the shirts on our backs and the houses we live in our potlatches. This poor backward society has to be helped. But, when we compare it as a political system, we think our political system is better because we were in sort of politics, not for our own personal gain, but for the good of our nation.
Janice, maybe I can bring you in here. Help us understand what the implications were of imposing this idea of elected band councils to replace hereditary chiefs.
Yeah, I just want to kind of build off of what Bob was talking about and just to paint this picture to listeners that the banning of the sundances, the potlatches, and ceremonies was not just banning cultural traditions. It was essentially banning very sophisticated laws, legal structures, governance structures that Indigenous peoples had practiced for generations. So when we talk about the imposition of elected band councils, it was essentially replacing ancient practices, systems of laws and governance that guided families, guided communities into a completely foreign way of leading, foreign way of selecting leaders, foreign way of governing the nation. And it also imposed patriarchy onto communities and families. So that's the impact of an imposed foreign electoral system and the changes to how, the banishment of these ceremonies and practices.
Bob, Pierre Trudeau's government tried to get rid of the Indian Act in 1969. The goal, according to the white paper, was to improve outcomes for First Nations people and achieve full and equal participation in Canadian society. Some First Nations leaders rejected that and came out with this alternative red paper. What was that pushback fundamentally about?
Yeah, so we'd gone through this whole period of, forced cultural assimilation under the Indian Act. We'd arrived at a place in the, as a country in the 1960s where we realized it's not working and it's going to be a long time in getting it to work. And so Trudeau and Chrétien were sent out really to try to figure out what to do with it. And they came back with the 1969 white paper, policy paper. And, they said we live in an unjust society. These people live on different lands and under different laws than everybody else. And we should transfer title to the reserves, get rid of the Indian Act, and that'll create better outcomes for people. And you're correct. The chiefs did counter with a red paper, policy paper. What the chiefs heard at that time was, you're just going to cut us loose right now with little or no opportunity to pick ourselves up and look after ourselves. We're dependent on the system that you've been enforcing upon us, and you can't just simply cut us loose. You actually have a legal obligation, because we're wards of the crown, to look after us. You can't just throw wards of the crown out on the street. So they said, we're going to hold you to your legal obligation to look after us until we, assimilate, or until you sit down and talk to us about how we can move to self-government and how we will be able to, participate in the political and economic mainstream of this country, but in a way that protects our cultures, just like everybody else who came here were able to protect their cultures. And so that was the pushback of that policy.
Janice, the Act has also been called unquestionably sexist. Why is that?
Yeah, like the first versions of the Indian Act from the 1800s literally said that women could not be Indian unless they were married to an Indian man. And so that's where the introduction of this patriarchy and sex discrimination originates from. And then as you carry on down the years and there's amendments made, some of that language is taken out, but the process of the control, the impacts of that on governance, membership, leadership still remains to this day.
There is this ongoing conversation now, Janice, about efforts to amend the Indian Act when it comes to questions around family and status. So in 1985, there was an amendment that addressed what you've just mentioned. Now, the government is studying Bill S2. This seeks to address what's called second-generation cutoff, meaning being cut off from having Indian status. We're going to talk more about it in the program in a moment, but explain to us how we have come to a place that this is the debate now.
I think that people are starting to realize that they've lost the ability to have connection to the community, their family that they were born into by virtue of these sexist, discriminatory elements contained within the Indian Act. And people, women in particular, I would say over the past 50 plus years, have been trying to fight, reclaim, regain status because it was lost through a variety of different mechanisms, whether they married non-status, non-Indigenous partners. And I think I'll bring this back to the point of how does this impact people personally? For us, like for women, especially Indigenous women, we actually have to think about who are we going to have children with? Who are we going to marry? Because that determines the ability or whether or not our child or children will be status. And then that then determines whether they have connection to their Indigenous identity, the connection to the band, the connection to the land where they're from, and the ability to access different programs and benefits that are tied to being status. So it's really complex.
In a way, the Act affects who you love.
Yep, it does. Like I've had conversations with my brother about this, And we just kind of had to sit there one day and reflect on this really affects like who we fall in love with, who we're in a relationship with, like who we build a family with.
So let me ask you both in closing, and Janice, I'll start with you. The fundamental question, is the Indian Act still, right now, a racist, sexist piece of legislation?
I would say yes, it is. But when we talk about repealing or replacing it, it has to be done with First Nations input. It can't be done by governments and government to replace it with something that they think is what we need. And if we're talking about replacing anything, there needs to be a restoration and rebuilding of the original laws, governance structures, and the treaties and the treaty relationship that existed and was the intent of what the nation-to-nation relationship was supposed to be.
Bob, is this still, in your mind, a racist, sexist law?
I think it's got all of the trappings for sure, right? It doesn't apply to other people, Indian people. And it certainly is, has created the challenges that we've been talking about just the last few minutes here. When we think about picking who you have to marry because you want your kids to be status. And, the Indian Act is still doing what it was initially designed to do, which is troll people off the list. It's still trying to assimilate, even though we abandoned forced cultural assimilation in, the early 80s with the patriation of the Constitution. The Indian Act's like a drift net that's broken free of the mothership and is still doing what it was designed to do. And so we've got to be able to decide who our people are. Nobody in Ottawa should be able to decide who our people are or tell us how to govern ourselves or, to be able to do that with freely chosen leaders and freely chosen people and to try to break away from this piece of legislation, which often was done in the name of equality. They should be like everybody else. But we're really a human rights country. We let other people come here and they're able to hang on to whatever parts of their identity that they wanted, but we're still being asked to give up who we are in a country that's largely seen as a protector of human rights around the globe.
Thank you both so much for this conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Bob. It was such an honor and pleasure.
The University of Windsor's Janice McCocas and Bob Joseph, author of 21 Things You Might Not Know About the Indian Act. Over its 150-year history, the Indian Act has been amended a number of times. We want to zoom in further now on the latest effort, known as Bill S-2. We mentioned it in our last conversation. It's legislation that would get rid of the second-generation cutoff, limiting who can pass down status. It's deeply personal for Dawn Laval Harvard. She's the former president of the Native Women's Association of Canada. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So how does the second-generation cutoff affect your family?
My two younger daughters, Eva and Brianna, they are 6'2", which means they are the cutoff. As we say, the end of the line, it ends with them. They won't have the ability, unless they marry somebody else with status, to pass along any stat to their children. And if they can't pass along status to their children, that has implications in terms of their rights to be members in our community, for their rights to even live in our community, potential, inheriting property from my mother, from our family. Our family, it literally ends with them.
Wow. How does that leave you feeling? Is it a sense of frustration or irritation, or what does it mean to you personally?
Well, this is one of these things where it's all of those emotions rolled into one, because on the one hand, there's this profound, gut-wrenching sadness when you realize that that's, my grandchildren won't have the same opportunities. They won't have the same rights. They won't have the same ability to be members in our community. And that is who we are. That is the essence of our identity and our being. And I work with young people now, and so much of that is also our mental health is connected to that sense of belonging, that right to belong in our community. So it's a very deep and profound sadness, but at the same time, it's a whole fireball of rage, because I know my mother has been fighting this since 1970. This has been the central organizing factor theme of my entire existence since I was born in 1974 has been my mother's fight to get her status, her original status back, to get status for us, and to get status for, my children, her grandchildren. And now for me, I've simply inherited this, and not simply, but I have inherited this torch because my mother is now 84 years old. And she talks about how she wants to see this. She wants to see those rights guaranteed for her descendants, for my grandchildren, that would, potential grandchildren. She wants to see that right before she talks about how she wants to see that before she enters into the spirit world, because she's nearing the end of her journey.
So help us with a little bit more about your mother, Jeanette Corbière-Laval. She was part of a fight that also had to do with status, but a different one. Can you explain it to us?
Yeah, so she was, in fact, one of the first women. She was the first woman who went all the way to the Supreme Court. She challenged, the discrimination under the Indian Act because she lost her status when she married my father, who is a non-Indian. She lost her status. She lost her right to be a member of her community. And in those days, she actually lost her right to even go back to her community because there was, very, very clear rules in those days. So she knew this was not right. She went all the way to Supreme Court, eventually ended up actually losing by one vote in the Supreme Court, basically on a technicality, but then spent the next 50 years of her life continuing that fight.
So now there is this effort with this piece of legislation from the Senate, S2, to change things around, go from the second generation cutoff to what's known as a one-parent rule. How would that work?
Much the same way as Canadian citizenship does. And this is one of the things that, we talk about. We need to start thinking about ourselves. We think about ourselves as nations, but we need to start demanding that we have the same rights as nations. And as the Canadian nation does, Canadian citizens have the right to pass on their citizenship to their child, regardless of who they marry. And we're simply asking for the same thing. We're simply asking that if I, as a Anishinaabe woman, or my brother as a Anishinaabe man, has a child, that I would have the right to pass on my status to my child, regardless of who I marry. And then that child would have that same right in perpetuity. And somebody actually at Senate, and I wish I remember who it was who said it to me, said, well, so what is it that you want? So that means we would have status Indians in perpetuity? And I said, yes, of course that's what it means. Isn't that the same thing that everybody wants? Unless the government is willing to agree or admit that they don't want status Indians in perpetuity, then we have to change this because it's an extinction clause. If we don't create a one-parent rule, which means we have the right to pass on our status, then it means there will be eventual extinction of our First Nations. And for many First Nations, the smaller ones, it's coming sooner rather than later.
Dawn Laval, Harvard. I'm Catherine Cullen, and you're listening to a special edition of The House, all about the past, present, and future of the Indian Act. I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Make sure to give us a follow so you never miss an episode, and tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca.
Wait. Ani Shepide.
Wag, such.
Back at the Kitigan-Zibi Band office, we catch a bit of conversation in Algonquin as we go past the front desk to see Nick Ottawa. He's the one here responsible for registering new members. Okay. He's cross-referencing new claims against an ancestry database.
So as an example, I could click on an individual and I could tell it show me everybody that three generation descendancy or something like that. And I could pull
the pile of new registration applications has grown after 2 recent court rulings. Since then, Nick Ottawa says there's been 1,000 new registrations for a community only 4 times that size. And if Bill S2 becomes law and ends the second-generation cutoff, he believes they'll see hundreds, if not thousands, of new applications. So he's careful to cross-check genealogical records.
Under the laws of the Indian Act, we can protest. We have 3 years, so sometimes it takes a lot of research to verify. Someone working on the entitlement sector at the department, they could determine someone a band member just based on the chances of probability without any proof at all. So that makes it a little harder from our end and also to explain to our First Nation members here within the community how this individual connects, because sometimes when you're operating on chances of probability, how do you explain that to a community member? I can't say, well, this person tied into your great-great-grandmother. No, someone at Indian Affairs determined that this person belongs here.
The First Nations members he has to explain this to include his own daughter. Nick's daughter, Haley, cannot pass her Indian status to her children because her mother is not Indigenous.
She gets upset. If she has a child with a non-Native person, the Indian Act says status stops there. But she goes, Dad, I'm an Anishinaabe. I know my community. People know me. I know my language. I went to school. I did the whole 9 yards. I practiced my culture. She's very well involved in the community. But someone who doesn't even know, a lot of times their family registers them. And how is it someone doesn't even know how they connect to the band from so many generations away? They know nothing, but now they could register their child and I can't.
So you have these strong feelings, and here you are every day dealing with this registration process. What is it like when someone comes to you and says, okay, I'm here to register?
Mixed reaction, mixed feelings. Sometimes a lot of it also depends. Sometimes we get individuals who actually want to be a part of the community. They want to do good. They want to get involved. Other times people are just not shy and they're just like, what do I get? What can this give me? So it is a mixture of reactions on not just my part, but I feel the community as well. I'm a big supporter of, if you're going to say you're from Kitigan-Zibi or identify that you're from KZ, the community also has to reciprocate, and you have to have that sense of responsibility, not just what can I get. So a lot of these individuals that are coming in, we can be inclusive. I have no problem with them being a part of the community, but if they're not going to be a part of the community, that's where the real issue lies.
This question of this piece of legislation, S2, right, that would change the rules around whether or not somebody can essentially lose their status after 2 generations. What do you think about the possibility of that law being passed and the rules changing?
Well, I think the perfect solution would be put it into our hands, First Nations hands, and we could determine as each individual First Nation or within the nation, who are we as a people. I do understand, like I said, a lot of the reasoning. So as an example, a white man who married a non-Native woman, she lost status. Whereas when it was male-based, the white woman who married a Native guy, she would gain status. So that shouldn't have happened. That's not our fault. It's at First Nation levels. That's the Canadian government that decided those things. So the new laws they're creating today are trying to rectify wrongs that Canada did, not we as First Nations.
So this is something you've been thinking about sort of day in and day out in the course of your work for a long time.
Yes.
So how do you feel about the Indian Act?
Well, how did Canada feel when Trump decided that someone's going to be our governor? Or how does a regular Canadian determine that they're Canadian? Is it because they're told by Canada? Is it because they were born here and they self-identify as being a Canadian? What if they were told that they were not? Or who, according to someone else's, as an example, if we left it up to Trump today and he determined who's Canadian and who's not, how would people react?
Furious.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of situation that we are in as First Nations. Is it's always been dictated to us by Canada. Who are we? How are we defined under the Indian Act?
So there are strong opinions about whether this bill should become law. The federal government doesn't sound so certain. Here's Indigenous Services Minister Mandy Gulmasti speaking last week.
The question is not about whether or not we will lift second generation. The question is simply about how. I know that in the recent few weeks, there has been a lot of positioning to support a one-parent rule. I want to respect that communities have the right to decide for themselves. If you feel that a one-parent rule supports your community, that is your path to take. I also want to be clear that there are other communities who want more than that, who want a different option.
We asked the minister for an interview, but her office declined. To help us make sense of where this conversation about status is going, Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. Thanks for joining us, Nigan.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks for having me.
When you hear Minister Gulmasty's comments, what does that tell you about whether this law is likely to pass?
Yeah, I don't think we're looking at this bill passed anytime soon. And while the minister's comments are certainly, I think, worth a lot because she's the one who travels, she's the one who spends a lot of time with chiefs, it comes across sometimes as a little disingenuine that the federal Liberal Party, which has just spent a series of years, and I realize that the minister currently was not in government at that time, but has spent a number of years recognizing communities that are highly controversial, that have communities, for instance, in Ontario, who are recognized as Métis communities, where other Métis have not recognized them as Métis peoples. The federal government is frequently in this position of recognizing who is and who is not First Nations or Métis. I don't know why suddenly the federal government's suddenly now stuck on the issue of consultation and is holding everything up because they're worried about all opinions of First Nations. It's a little complicated, and it also is very unbalanced and unstable in terms of their response on this issue. This law particularly will bring in approximately anywhere between 100 to 250,000 people who have been disenfranchised from the Indian Act, which is a Canadian problem, not a First Nations problem, because of course the Indian Act is a deficiency model. It's based on sort of a diluting blood system that people will then no longer be part of communities, even though they are the children of members of those communities.
If this bill doesn't get passed, the second generation cutoff remains in place. Do you see another path for getting this problem fixed?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is that First Nations should have control over their own membership, and that membership should come with teeth. It should come with a recognition that First Nations have sovereignty in the ways in which they include and give rights to or recognize the rights of their members. We see this in the United States all the time, and the world hasn't fallen apart. In fact, what it has done is fortified a kind of sense of sovereignty in many Native American communities. First Nations, Métis, Inuit people in Canada, and in the case of Métis people, for instance, in Manitoba, they control their own membership, and therefore they control the ways who is and who is not a person that will inherit those rights, and the formula that will then be used for who they marry and how will they be maintaining their relationships to that nation. First Nations are always put in this position of subservience by the federal government, and so that's a serious problem.
What is stopping the federal government from just proceeding down that path right now?
Well, it's an issue of power and control. There's a kind of stereotype belief within federal circles that if First Nations get control over their own membership, for example, that will lead to control over their own lands. And then suddenly, there's an idea going back to the early days of Canadian Confederation that you can't just simply to dictate to First Nations what they can and cannot do. And in more recent times, of course, this has been reversing. This has been very much turning towards First Nations having control over First Nations issues. But the federal government's very slow to acquiesce their power and control. And membership is one of the key critical issues. But I would also say land and water and resource development. There is a very slow movement by the federal government to give First Nations control over anything. And membership is one of those things.
Do you think it is also about money, that if the federal government were to do that, it would have to ensure that these communities had the resources to support, to help all these new people who would no longer be, as you put it a few moments ago, disenfranchised?
Well, I think what's holding things up is that there is a general paranoia and fear, and in some circles, perhaps legitimately, that there would be a onset of new members on First Nations, and therefore the government would have their legal obligations to actually provide, which would fulfill the law. But if the federal government hasn't budgeted for fulfilling the law, then they're going to be in a position, especially in this economy at the moment where they see other issues, other priorities, that they would be in a very tight position. And so I think what you're seeing with the minister, and particularly with this government, is a sort of slow moving action in order to just push this towards consultation, in order to kick the can down the road and to not deal with this issue by using the argument of consultation and sort of wrapping it up in community discussions for a series of years and then have some other government try to deal with it later.
Thank you very much for this conversation, Niigaan.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks so much.
Professor of Indigenous Studies, Niigaan Sinclair. I'm Catherine Cullen, and this is a special edition of The House, looking at 150 years of the Indian Act. While it is still largely the law of the land, there are some communities who have settled on an alternative to the Indian Act. We checked in with one group of nations celebrating their independence.
Looking down, I found a vantage point where I could see all of our citizens that have gathered together, singing and dancing. So it's an awe. It's an amazing, awe-inspiring scene I'm looking at. So we have our eldest citizens sitting with some of our newest citizens and looking at a 3-week-old baby actually was being danced to in amongst the crowd. It's absolutely fantastic.
The sounds of joy from the Huchuklasat tribe, who were celebrating their independence on Wednesday. 15 years ago, on April 1st, the Manalth Treaty went into effect, an agreement between BC, Canada, and 5 First Nations on Vancouver Island that granted them governance over their land and people. The agreement lifted those nations out from under the Indian Act. So, is the Manalth an example of what a future without the Indian Act could look like? John Jack is Chief Counselor of the Huu-ay-aht First Nation, one of the 5 nations in the Manalth Treaty. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Fundamentally, this is about independence from the Indian Act. Am I right to understand that someone burned a copy of the Indian Act after the treaty became law?
Absolutely. One of our chief negotiators and a hereditary leader of the Huu-ay-aht First Nations, he had the entire Indian Act printed out on the office printer, and he set up a small fire on the steps or just outside the entrance of our great hall, the House of Huu-ay-aht, and he handed out pages of the Indian Act for people to throw into the fire as we filed in at midnight to pass all of our own laws, all of our own pieces of legislation and regulations that would kind of take up the vacuum left behind by the Indian Act. It was seen as an act of defiance, but also an act of triumph, and it was definitely one of my core memories of that day.
What changed for your communities when that treaty went into effect 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think the biggest change was that we were no longer subject to the Indian Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that has entirely too much say over the life and community and lands and waters and natural resources of First Nations in Canada. When we became self-governing, we were responsible to ourselves. We finally had the ability to make decisions for ourselves, not only who we were, how we made decisions, who our leaders were. We could make decisions about what we wanted our future to look like and work towards that without it being subject to the interference or misunderstandings of people in Vancouver or Ottawa.
What is another example of something that you are now able to do that you weren't before?
So our First Nation, before we became self-governing, we were unable as a nation to do the things we needed to do to catch up and keep up, so to speak. If you look at the stats for our people, we are behind in education and income and life expectancy and infant mortality. So we need to do the things as a community in order to develop ourselves, not just economically, but culturally and politically. And all of these things need to be enabled by programs and services that aren't necessarily being offered under the Indian Act. When you are a self-governing First Nation, you can make decisions that create the economy, that create the revenue sources, that create the institutions that will help carry you into the future in ways that aren't always possible under the Indian Act. And so our First Nation, we have comprehensive care for our people. We have an entire department that is devoted to helping families raise their children well, stay together, and for families that have been separated due to apprehensions, we have programs and services that will help bring families back together. We have economic development initiatives that will help bring jobs and, importantly, revenue to our community so that we can pay for things like trauma-informed counselors and daycares, early childhood educators, and help to pay for all those things we need to build in order to have a community.
And you couldn't do that under the Indian Act?
Not under the Indian Act. First Nations weren't allowed to directly own companies that were operating. We weren't always, in the past, able to own investments to put money away. And so these are the types of things that we're able to do now. And so we have a whole set of tools, not just to make decisions for our people, but also to help build a community and use the stability that we can create in the now to help build and enable a future for our community and all our people. We weren't able to do that before. And so this is a step towards further self-reliance. This is a step towards constructive interdependence between the people within our community, between our communities and neighbors, as well as with BC and Canada. This is something where when you choose treaty, you choose to become a part of. Treaties are not divorces, they're new relationships. And that provides us the opportunity to work with our neighbors, work with our friends and relatives and partners in BC and Canada to actually make change for everyone. And to be able to be a part of a positive, constructive relationship rather than an adversarial zero-sum relationship is something that is a huge change, not just for our community, but for the Canadian experience. And I think treaty itself is the best process by which we can really achieve the goals of reconciliation. To understand that we're here together, no one's going anywhere. We actually have a lot more in common if we just choose to trust one another. And I think that the treaty helps enable that. And that's what makes me proud.
Do you think the Manul's example can be the model for other First Nations going forward to move towards a world without the Indian Act?
I do. I think that treaty negotiations in a modern context are markedly different than the historic examples. And I do think it's a better use of time. I think that treaty negotiations and ultimately achieving a treaty that gives self-government and control over lands and resources is really the point. When you think of the march of history, you see Indigenous rights and titles really developing over time and being accepted. But what you also see are people who are trying to choose between using the courts and asserting their rights and title, but not really understanding that once you win a case, the mandate is for you to get in a room and negotiate. So you save a lot of time by just getting in a room and negotiating. And I think that takes a lot of faith. But the end result creates so much potential and all of the tools that are necessary to really make people's lives better, to really rebuild a nation in a way that it should have been from the beginning. We're constantly becoming who we should have been at Hawaiian, and the treaty is the reason we're able to do it. And so I do think that the treaty is ultimately the best route for Indigenous communities to create their own destiny and do it in partnership with those around them.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to help.
John Jack is the Chief Counselor of the Hawaiian First Nation. Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, representing more than 630 nations across Canada. Given the complexity of the different First Nations histories and treaties across the country, I asked her if what John Jack's First Nation negotiated is a path other First Nations could take.
First Nations people around the entire world are the only people that are legislated under the Indian Act around the entire world. Imagine that. Billions of people And the 1.4 million First Nations people are affected by this act, not the Inuit, not the Métis, only First Nations. I think some people would say there's some small protections in there, but there's a lot of discrimination within the Indian Act, and it's caused a lot of havoc, in this country.
So when it comes to getting out from under it, because we've heard many voices in this show talking about the problems and the challenges, is a modern treaty what's going to work for large swaths of your members, or is there a different path that you see?
Well, I commend, the people that are working on modern treaty. I know they're pushing right now for their own modern day treaty commissioner, and I commend their hard work. I commend various groups that are finding their own path forward that are First Nations led. And I think that's the difference when it's First Nations led in partnership, co-developed together. That's how we're going to find our way out. And it's not going to be a one size fits all approach. And, I lift up people that are taking over their own sovereignty, their own future, and wanting to leave a better life for their kids. We've got a diversity of groups across the country. Not everybody's treaty. We've got non-treaty. We've got French peace and friendship treaties. We've got Robinson Huron. We've got modern day that people are working on, and some that have never surrendered, have never unceded, unsurrendered territories. All of those issues need to be worked on directly with that group, with that First Nations group, wherever that may be in this country. And, their languages may be different, their cultures may be different, but they will know the path forward if you just ask them, instead of trying to shove down a paternalistic system on our people.
We're coming to the end of this special episode about 150 years of the Indian Act. Why is it important that there not be another 150 years?
There's a tough geopolitical climate all around the world. And yes, we have to pay attention to what's happening globally. But I think internally here, we do have to start to fix some of the, and start to work more closely together to fix some of these issues that exist. Land issues and rights issues. And First Nations have fought for this country since the beginning of time on every world war. We've been there at the front lines more than any other group of people. We love our country. It's important to settle some of our maybe disagreements, look through the Indian Act and start focusing on the 94 calls to action, by the way, on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's, reconciliation is not just, okay, do this and this and this, and then we get there. It's a journey together to make our country the best that it can be. And it starts by rectifying the wrongs of the past and by working with First Nations people to implement the way forward. And look, we're partners. We're foundational partners in this country and the creation of this country. And I think that we need to get back to that and get back to, the basics and the roots of, mutual respect, mutual understanding for each other, and taking the best from each other.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having us. Miigwech.
National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak. That's it for this special edition of The House. Our crew this week is Kristen Everson, Benjamin Lopez-Stephen, Theo Van Busekam, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Miguel Plant, and special thanks this week to Joy Spear Chief Morris. I'm Catherine Cullen. We're back again next week.